Some childhoods do not end when the house is left behind. They continue quietly, in the body, in relationships, in the strange ache that appears when love is offered gently and received with suspicion. A child who was not held with emotional safety often becomes an adult who seems strong, thoughtful, capable. But somewhere beneath that competence there is often a private weather system of doubt, a fear of asking, a habit of shrinking, a tenderness toward others, and a hardness toward the self. To be unloved as a child does not always mean there was no roof, no food, no structure. Sometimes it means something far less visible, that no one truly noticed the trembling beneath the silence, that feelings were managed, corrected, dismissed, or ignored. And so the child learned a painful translation. Love must be earned, hidden from, or survived. What follows is not a diagnosis, it is a mirror. A quiet exploration of how early emotional absence can echo through a life, long after the childhood itself has disappeared. The quiet recognition. There are people who move through the world with extraordinary sensitivity, yet speak of themselves as if they are too much. They apologize quickly. They read a room before entering it. They sense disappointment in a pause, rejection in a delayed reply, abandonment in a shift of tone so subtle that others barely notice it. On the surface, this can look like self-awareness, even kindness. But beneath it, there is often something older, a nervous system shaped by uncertainty, a heart that learned early that love could not simply be trusted to remain. This is how an unloved childhood often survives into adult life, not as a clear memory, but as a style of being. Some become hyper-independent. They need no one, or at least they try not to. They carry their own pain in silence because needing comfort once felt humiliating or useless. Others move in the opposite direction, becoming experts in anticipation. They become what others need before anyone has to ask. They become agreeable, useful, emotionally fluent in everyone's moods but their own. In both cases, the same quiet belief often lingers underneath. Closeness is conditional, and so ordinary moments begin to carry extraordinary weight. A friend becomes distant for a day, and it feels like a verdict. A partner asks for space, and an ancient panic stirs. Praise is deflected. Affection feels suspicious. Rest feels undeserved. Even joy can feel unstable, as if the mind is already preparing for its disappearance. What makes this pattern so difficult to recognize is that it often hides behind functionality. These are not always people who appear wounded. Many are articulate, high-achieving, deeply thoughtful. They know how to perform steadiness. They know how to be dependable. But internally, they may be living with a constant low hum of self-doubt, scanning for signs that they have disappointed someone, burdened someone, revealed too much. There is also another form this wound can take. Not anxiety, but numbness. Not overreaching, but detachment. Some people do not feel chronically needy. They feel strangely blank. They struggle to name what they want. They confuse peace with emotional disconnection. They enter relationships, friendships, even careers without a clear sense of longing because longing itself once felt dangerous. It is hard to miss what was never safe enough to desire openly. Recognition begins here, not in dramatic memories, but in the small and repetitive griefs of adulthood, in the way tenderness feels unfamiliar, in the way the self is monitored, edited, withheld, in the way some people become so skilled at surviving that no one realizes they are still waiting to feel chosen without performance. Where love went missing, people often imagine an unloved childhood as something obvious. A house filled with shouting, cruelty without disguise, neglect severe enough to leave visible evidence, and sometimes that is true. But many unloved children come from homes that looked ordinary from the outside. The lunches were packed, birthdays were acknowledged, school was attended, rules existed. The family photo suggested stability. What was missing was harder to photograph, emotional presence, the simple, life-shaping experience of being felt. A child does not only need food, protection, and instruction. A child also needs someone who notices the trembling behind the anger, the loneliness behind the silence, the fear hidden inside misbehavior. Someone who can say, in words or in tone, "Your feelings do not frighten me. Your inner world matters here." When that kind of love is absent, the child begins adapting long before language can explain what is happening. Sometimes affection was conditional. Warmth arrived after achievement, obedience, or charm. Love was not exactly gone, but it seemed to tighten and loosen depending on performance. The child learned quickly that approval could be won, but not rested in. Sometimes the caregivers themselves were emotionally stranded, depressed, overwhelmed, dissociated, wounded by their own histories. They may have provided everything practical while remaining inaccessible in the places that mattered most. The child could be seen physically and still remain emotionally invisible. In some homes, vulnerability was treated like inconvenience. Tears were excessive, anger was disrespect, fear was weakness, needs were burdens. The child who reached out and found dismissal would eventually begin to withdraw, not because the need disappeared, but because the humiliation of having it unmet became too painful. And sometimes the wound came through inconsistency. Love one day, distance the next, praise in public, coldness in private, comfort when the adult had energy, rejection when they did not. This unpredictability can shape a child just as profoundly as outright neglect, because it teaches the nervous system to stay alert, to never quite settle, to search constantly for clues about which version of love will arrive today. None of this requires villainy to leave a scar. That is part of what makes these histories so confusing. The child may grow up protecting the image of the caregiver while quietly mistrusting their own pain. They may say, "Nothing terrible happened," and still carry the unmistakable weight of emotional deprivation. They may feel guilty for naming the absence because the absence was made of subtleties. Tone, withdrawal, non-response, the long ache of never quite being met. An unloved child is not always a child no one cared about. Sometimes it's a child no one knew how to love in the way a developing heart needed. And the body remembers that difference with astonishing precision. The mind adapts. The child's mind is not built merely to understand the world. It is built to survive it. This is why early emotional neglect becomes more than a sad memory. It becomes a blueprint. The brain, the body, the attachment system, even the developing sense of self begin organizing around one central task: how to remain safe in a world where connection feels uncertain. Psychology has many names for this process: attachment adaptation, emotional conditioning, nervous system patterning. But beneath the language, the reality is deeply human. A child depends on caregivers not only for survival, but for regulation. Before the child can calm alone, someone must first help them be calmed. Before the child can believe they matter, someone must consistently treat them as if they do. When this does not happen reliably, the nervous system changes its expectations. Some children become anxiously attached. They become exquisitely attuned to signs of distance, learning to pursue connection with urgency because it feels unstable. Others become avoidantly organized, dampening need itself, minimizing desire for closeness because closeness has become too unreliable or intrusive. Some move between both states, craving intimacy and fearing it in the same breath. These are not personality flaws. They are intelligent adaptations. The brain also learns through repetition. If a child's distress is ignored or punished, emotional expression begins to feel unsafe. If joy is not mirrored, joy can become strangely muted. If mistakes invite shame rather than repair, perfectionism begins to look like protection. Over time, the child may form implicit beliefs that feel less like thoughts and more like truths. My needs are too much. Love leaves. I must earn care. If I relax, I will be hurt. Because these beliefs are often formed before full language develops, they tend to live in the body first. That is why adult reactions can seem disproportionate even to the person experiencing them. A delayed text can trigger real panic. Genuine affection can create discomfort. Conflict can feel catastrophic. Praise can slide off the skin without landing anywhere meaningful. The adult mind may know better, but the body is reacting to an older world. Neuroscience suggests that early relational experiences shape emotional regulation, stress response, and threat perception. But science, for all its precision, is only describing something ancient. The body keeps score of what the heart had to learn too soon. So the adult who seems cold may once have been overwhelmed. The adult who seems needy may once have been abandoned emotionally. The adult who overachieves may once have discovered that excellence was the nearest available substitute for closeness. The mind adapts because it must. And many of the behaviors later called difficult, dramatic, guarded, or intense are simply the long afterlife of a child trying to make sense of love that did not feel safe enough to trust. love becomes conflict. By adulthood, the original wound is rarely experienced as childhood. It is experienced as relationship. A person longs to be close, but closeness stirs fear. They want to be understood, but being fully seen feels exposed. They crave reassurance, then mistrust it when it comes. They move toward love and away from it in the same motion, as if the heart and the nervous system have not agreed on what intimacy means. This is one of the most painful legacies of being unloved early. Love does not arrive as rest. It arrives as conflict. Some begin to test others without meaning to. They withdraw to see who follows. They become quiet when hurt, hoping someone will notice without being told. They expect disappointment and then collect evidence for it in every imperfect moment. Not because they enjoy pain, but because familiar pain can feel more manageable than unfamiliar safety. Others become masters of performance. They become easy to love from the outside, competent, attentive, self-contained, impressive. But the self being loved is often curated. They hide need, hide anger, hide grief, hide softness. Somewhere inside there is still a child who suspects that the full truth of who they are would be too inconvenient to keep. Then there is the matter of resistance. When old wounds are touched, people often imagine healing should feel relieving. But often the opposite occurs first. Genuine care can feel destabilizing because it contradicts the internal map. Slowness feels suspicious. Consistency feels unreal. A kind partner, a loyal friend, a calm conversation. These things can unsettle a person whose system was trained on unpredictability. Chaos feels recognizable. Peace can feel like a trick. This is why self-sabotage is so often misunderstood. It is not always a wish to destroy what is good. Sometimes it is the reflex of an old protection system trying to restore emotional conditions it knows how to navigate. If disappointment is inevitable, it can feel safer to cause it early. If abandonment is expected, leaving first may feel like dignity. If love once came with control, criticism, or neglect, then being deeply cared for may produce confusion rather than relief. And underneath all of this sits shame. Not just the shame of being hurt, but the shame of still being shaped by that hurt. The private fear that one is difficult to love, too intense, too distant, too complicated, too hungry, too guarded, too much, and not enough at once. This is the cruelty of early deprivation. It often teaches the child to blame the self for the absence of love. So even long after the childhood has ended, many continue entering rooms, relationships, and inner conversations already braced for the possibility that they will have to deserve their place there. The moment of seeing healing rarely begins with confidence. It begins with interruption, a small, quiet interruption in the old story. Sometimes it happens in a conversation that lands differently than expected. Sometimes in therapy, sometimes in exhaustion, sometimes in the strange grief that appears after being loved by someone kind and realizing how unfamiliar kindness still feels. The turning point is not always dramatic. Often, it is simply this. The person begins to notice that the pain has a pattern, and once a pattern is seen, shame begins to loosen. There is something profoundly life-changing about realizing that a reaction is not evidence of brokenness, but evidence of history. That the panic, the withdrawal, the overfunctioning, the numbness, the fear of burdening others, none of these appeared from nowhere. They were learned, rehearsed, refined over years in response to emotional conditions that required adaptation. This realization does not erase grief. In some ways, it deepens it. Because to understand the origin is also to face what was missing, the comfort that never came in time, the softness that should have existed without negotiation, the reality that a child had to become emotionally self-sufficient long before it was developmentally fair. There is sorrow in that recognition. Not dramatic sorrow, perhaps, but a slow and sacred kind. The sorrow of finally telling the truth. Yet truth can be gentler than denial. For many, this is the first moment in which the self is no longer treated as the enemy. The behaviors that once seemed embarrassing begin to reveal their hidden logic. The guardedness was protection. The people-pleasing was adaptation. Yeah, the perfectionism was a shelter. The distance was a defense against humiliation. The need for reassurance was not weakness, but the echo of an attachment hunger that had nowhere safe to go. A person may begin to understand that what they called personality was often survival structure. This does not mean identity disappears, it means compassion enters. The inner voice, once harsh and corrective, may begin to sound slightly different. Less accusing, more curious, less, "What is wrong with you?" more, "What happened to you that made this feel necessary?" That single shift can alter an entire inner landscape. The turning point is not the moment pain ends, it is the moment pain stops being mistaken for proof of worthlessness. And in that subtle but radical distinction, something begins to open. Not certainty, not mastery, but the possibility that the unloved child was never unlovable, only underheld, only unseen, only shaped by absences they did not deserve. Learning a different love. There is a stage of healing that feels less like becoming someone new and more like meeting what was hidden beneath protection. It is often quieter than expected. Not cinematic, not triumphant, just slow, almost imperceptible changes in what the body can tolerate. A person pauses before apologizing for existing. They notice the urge to withdraw, and beneath it the wish to stay. They feel affection and do not immediately distrust it. They sense sadness and do not rush to numb it into productivity. These moments are small, but they are not minor. They are evidence that the system is beginning to learn a different emotional language. Healing from childhood emotional neglect is not simply about receiving more love. It is about surviving the experience of receiving it. That may sound paradoxical, but for many it is true. To be cared for consistently can awaken grief for all the times care was absent. To rest in someone's patience can make earlier loneliness suddenly visible. To feel safe enough to soften can bring buried pain close to the surface. This is why healing is often inseparable from mourning. The person is not only building new patterns, they are also grieving the child who had to build old ones. And yet, integration begins here, in allowing both truths to coexist. The wound was real, the adaptations were necessary, but necessity is not destiny. The heart that learned to armor can also learn slowly what it means to remain. This new learning often involves relationships, but not only romantic ones. Sometimes it appears first in friendship, in the experience of being remembered, in being listened to without being fixed, in being upset and not abandoned for it, in discovering that conflict does not always mean rupture, and that need does not always lead to rejection. These ordinary experiences can be revolutionary to a nervous system that once expected emotional exile. The relationship with the self begins to change too, not into perfect self-love, but into less cruelty, a little more room for tenderness, a little less contempt for vulnerability. The old belief that worth must be proven begins to tire. Something softer starts taking its place, not confidence exactly, but permission. Permission to feel, permission to need, permission to be unfinished without being undeserving. Healing is often described as becoming whole, but perhaps it is more accurate to say it is the gradual end of self-abandonment. The person does not erase the child they were. They begin at last to stop leaving that child alone. What remains? What opens? In the end, an unloved childhood leaves more than pain. It leaves intelligence, sensitivity, pattern recognition, a deep literacy in moods, silences and invisible shifts. Many who were not loved well become adults of profound emotional depth. They know how to listen for what is not being said. They know how to sense sorrow beneath performance. They know something about survival that cannot be learned from comfort alone. And yet, survival has its limits. A life cannot fully bloom inside the architecture of constant self-protection. At some point, the old skills begin to ache in the hands that carry them. Hypervigilance becomes exhaustion. Self-erasure becomes loneliness. Over-independence becomes a private kind of grief. The armor that once saved the person begins to obstruct the very closeness they have always been quietly longing for. There is no perfect ending to this story. The past does not disappear because it has been understood. Some days the old feelings still return, the body still startles, the heart still braces. A tone of voice, a forgotten message, a season of distance, and suddenly the child self stirs again, asking the oldest questions. Am I too much? Did I do something wrong? Will I be left if I am fully known? But perhaps healing is not the permanent silencing of those questions. Perhaps it is the emergence of another presence beside them, a steadier voice, a deeper knowing. The understanding that these fears were inherited from emotional conditions, not from truth. That the child adapted brilliantly. that the adult does not need to despise those adaptations in order to outgrow them. That being unloved in the beginning can shape a life, but it does not have to define its final meaning. There is something sacred in this realization, not because it is easy, but because it is honest. The child who was not sufficiently loved may spend years mistaking deprivation for identity, years believing that hunger means defect, that loneliness means unworthiness, that vigilance means wisdom. And then one day, perhaps gradually, another possibility appears. The absence of love was never evidence that love was impossible, only evidence that it was not given where it should have been. And so what remains is not just sorrow. What remains is the quiet dignity of having endured. What opens is the possibility of being met differently, not perfectly, not endlessly, but truly. And sometimes, after a lifetime of bracing, truth is gentle enough.